She was a quiet girl who lived in a small town where everyone knew each other. Life was simple there, and most people followed the paths that their families had chosen for them. Her family was no different. They worked hard every day just to keep things running, and there was little time or money for dreams that seemed impossible. From the first time she picked up a violin, she knew that her dream was different from the world around her. She fell in love with the sound, how it could be soft and gentle, or strong and powerful. It felt like a voice that could express things words could not. But in a house that valued practicality over art, she often had to hide her playing. She practiced quietly in her room with the door closed. Sometimes late at night, when everyone else was asleep. She had started with a small, second-hand violin that her uncle had given her. The strings were old, and the wood had scratches, but to her, it was the most precious thing in the world. She learned by watching videos, listening to recordings, trying again and again until she could get even a simple melody right. Her fingers would often hurt, and the sound was not perfect, but she never gave up. Every day, she would sit in the corner of her room, bow in hand, eyes closed, imagining a stage, an audience, and the feeling of music filling a big hall. Her parents noticed that she liked the violin, but they thought it was just a hobby, something she would grow out of. They encouraged her to focus on school and practical skills, thinking music would not lead anywhere stable. Sometimes they would say things like, "It's good to have fun, but don't forget your real work." Or "You need to think about a future that pays." She would nod and smile, but inside her heart ached. She wanted more than just a hobby. She wanted to share her music with the world one day. A flyer appeared in the town square about an upcoming music competition in a nearby city. It was an opportunity for young musicians to perform in front of judges and a real audience. She stared at the flyer for hours, tracing the words with her finger. Her heart raced with excitement. This could be her chance to show what she could do. She imagined walking into a grand hall, the light shining, and the audience waiting in silence for her first note. She imagined the sound of her violin filling the space and touching people's hearts. It felt like a dream coming closer to reality. But then came the fear. She had no formal training, no famous teachers, no impressive certificates. She had only herself and hours of private practice in her small room. What if they laughed at her? What if they said she was not good enough? The thought of being rejected made her stomach twist. Still, something inside her refused to let the chance pass. She spent days preparing, choosing a piece that she felt deeply connected to, one that she had played hundreds of times in secret, perfecting it until she knew it by heart. She practiced until her fingers bled and her arms ached, ignoring everything else. Every note she played was a conversation with herself, a promise that she would not give up. Finally, she gathered the courage to go to the organizers and submit her application. Her hands shook as she handed over the form. The woman behind the desk looked at her casually, barely glancing at the papers, and then shook her head. "You don't meet the requirements," she said. "This competition is only for students from official music schools." The words hit her like a wall. She opened her mouth to explain, to tell them about all the hours she had practiced, all the sacrifices she had made, but the woman had already moved on to the next person. She felt her chest tighten, her vision blur with frustration and sadness. It was the first time she truly understood what rejection felt like in a world that measured people by certificates and connections rather than passion and heart. She walked home slowly, carrying her violin case like it was heavier than usual. The streets were quiet, and the sunset painted the town in warm colors, but she barely noticed. She wanted to cry, to scream, to disappear into the shadows. She sat on the steps outside her house and held her violin close, feeling the familiar comfort of its wooden body. She remembered all the nights she had spent practicing, all the moments when the music had been her only friend. And in that moment, she made a silent vow. She would not let this stop her. If the world refused to give her a chance, she would create her own. Over the next few weeks, she practiced more intensely than ever. She experimented with new melodies, played with emotions she had never expressed before, and pushed herself beyond what she thought was possible. Her small room became a sanctuary of music, a place where the outside world and its judgments could not touch her. Sometimes neighbors would peek in and smile, admiring her dedication, but most of the time, She was alone with her music. The sound of her violin grew stronger, richer, and more expressive. She learned how to make the instrument sing, how to make it cry, how to make it roar. Even though she was rejected from the competition, the dream remained alive. She watched performances online, imagining herself in their place. She studied the expressions of professional musicians, the way they moved with the instrument, the way their music told stories without words. She tried to copy them at first, but soon realized that the real magic came when she added her own feelings, her own struggles, her own experiences into the music. Each note became a piece of her story, every melody a reflection of her heart. Her family noticed the change in her. She was quieter, more focused, and at times lost in her own world. They didn't understand everything she was doing, but they saw the determination in her eyes and began to support her in small ways. Her mother would bring her tea while she practiced late at night, and her father repaired her violin when a string broke. Even though they still worried about her future, they could see that music had become a part of who she was. She began to dream again. Not just about competitions, but about moments when she could touch people with her music. She imagined playing in public parks, in small cafes, even on street corners if she had to. The idea of performing for anyone who would listen became thrilling. She realized that her journey was not just about winning recognition. It was about sharing a piece of herself with the world. Then, one evening, as she practiced a particularly difficult piece, her little brother came into the room. He listened quietly for a few minutes, then said, "You should play in front of people. They need to hear this." His words were simple, but they struck a chord in her heart. Maybe she didn't need formal permission to perform. Maybe she just needed the courage to step forward, even when others refused to see her potential. That night, she stayed up late, planning small ways to showcase her music. She thought about inviting friends over, or finding local events that allowed anyone to perform. She wrote down ideas, small steps that could eventually lead to something bigger. Her mind was buzzing with possibilities. The rejection from the competition still stung, but it no longer felt like the end. It felt like a challenge, a test of how far she was willing to go for her passion. Days turned into weeks, and she continued to play every chance she got. Her violin became an extension of her soul, carrying her hopes, fears, and dreams. She knew that the world might not give her a chance, but she was determined to find her own. Each evening as the sun set and the town grew quiet, the sound of her music drifted through the streets, a gentle reminder that talent cannot be hidden forever, and that sometimes the most extraordinary voices come from the most unexpected places. After the rejection, life seemed to go on as usual for the people around her, but for her, nothing felt the same. She walked through the town with her violin case in hand, feeling both the weight of disappointment and the pull of her passion. Each step reminded her of the competition she had wanted to enter, the stage she had dreamed of, and the chance that had been denied. Her heart ached, yet at the same time, there was a spark that refused to die. It was as if the more the world pushed her down, the stronger she became inside. She began spending longer hours in her small room, closing the door tightly behind her. The outside world seemed distant when she played, but the music carried everything she felt. Sometimes her hands shook from tension, sometimes they bled from effort, but she didn't stop. Each mistake was a lesson, each failure a stepping stone. She practiced pieces she loved and composed her own melodies late into the night. The sound of the violin became her companion, her only friend who never judged or dismissed her dreams. School was no easier. Teachers and classmates talked about future plans and competitions, often unaware of her quiet struggle. Some friends tried to encourage her, but most would shrug and say, "You should try something else. Music won't give you a real career." She smiled politely, but inside, the words hurt. How could she explain that music was not just a career to her, but a way of living, a voice that came from the deepest part of herself? She didn't have the right words. Perhaps they wouldn't have understood even if she had. Her parents noticed her dedication but remained cautious. They wanted her to have stability in life. They reminded her often, gently but firmly, that dreams could be dangerous if they led to disappointment. Still, they did what they could to support her. Her father fixed her violin when it needed care, and her mother brought her food when she practiced for hours without pause. Their small acts of support gave her strength. Even when their words sometimes made her feel misunderstood, in her moments of solitude, she began to reflect deeply on what music meant to her. She realized that it wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about expressing the feelings that she could not speak. The violin became an extension of her heart. She discovered that sadness could become beauty, anger could become rhythm, joy could soar through notes that seemed to dance in the air. She experimented, played with dynamics, tempo, and emotion, and slowly her music became something uniquely hers. No longer was she imitating others. Her violin was now telling her story. Every string and bow movement a reflection of her inner life. One afternoon, while walking home from school, she stopped by a small park. Children played on swings, old men sat on benches, and a few people strolled quietly. She found a secluded spot and took out her violin. At first she played for herself, letting the sound drift across the empty paths. But slowly people started to notice. A little boy stopped to listen, his mouth open in surprise. An elderly woman leaned on her cane, nodding along to the melody. The music felt different here, in the open air, with no walls around it. For the first time, she realized that sharing music with even a few people could be as powerful as performing in a grand hall. Encouraged, she returned to the park whenever she could. Playing in corners where people could discover her by chance, word began to spread. Neighbors who had never thought much about the violin started recognizing her sound. They would pause, listen, and smile. It was small recognition, quiet and unannounced, but it mattered more than any certificate could. For the first time, she felt that the world was slowly starting to notice, not through authority or approval, but through the honesty and passion of her music. Despite this, doubt never fully left her. She still thought about the competition, about the doors that had been closed to her. The sting of rejection sometimes returned in the middle of the night, and she would sit with her violin in her lap, unsure if all the effort was enough. But then she would play, and the music would calm her, reminding her that her value was not determined by rules or recognition, but by the truth of her own expression. She also began to connect with other young musicians online. They shared their own struggles, successes, and advice. Through messages and video calls, she discovered that many talented people faced the same barriers, the same doubts, and the same fear of rejection. Their stories gave her courage. Their encouragement gave her hope. She realized that music was not just about individual talent, but about community and connection. Even when she felt isolated, she was part of a larger world of people who shared her passion. As months passed, her skills improved dramatically. Her fingers moved with more confidence, her bow drew smoother lines, and her tone grew richer. Every note became more precise, every melody more expressive. She experimented with difficult pieces she had once thought impossible, and gradually, she mastered them. She recorded her own performances on a simple phone, listening to them critically and making adjustments. Each day, she pushed herself further, not to compete with others, but to become the best version of herself. Her family noticed the change in her demeanor. She seemed more alive, more focused, more certain of who she was. Though they didn't fully understand her dreams, they respected her commitment. They stopped asking her to give up music and instead asked about her pieces, listened quietly as she played for them, and sometimes even clapped at the end. Their small acceptance felt like a bridge, connecting her private world of music with the outside life. One rainy afternoon, she decided to perform in front of a small crowd in a local cafe. It was nothing official, just a few people who were willing to listen. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she carried her violin inside. The cafe was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and bread, the chatter of people creating a soft background noise. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and began to play. The first notes were shaky, but then she let herself flow with the music. Slowly, the room quieted. People stopped talking, lifted their eyes from their cups, and listened. She felt a connection she had never experienced before. The audience's attention was a form of recognition, subtle yet powerful, and it reminded her why she could not give up. By the time she finished, The cafe erupted in soft applause. Some people came to her and thanked her for playing. A few offered kind words and encouragement, telling her to keep performing. It was not the competition she had dreamed of, but it was real, tangible, and meaningful. She realized that success did not always come from approval by judges or certificates, but from the ability to touch hearts, even in small ways. That evening, walking home in the soft drizzle, she felt a sense of peace. The violin case felt lighter, her steps more confident. The world still had barriers, still had people who doubted her, still had competitions that had ignored her. But she had found her own way to rise above them. She had learned that talent alone was not enough. Courage, persistence, and honesty were equally important. She carried her music with her, not as a burden, but as a shield and a gift. She knew that her journey was just beginning, and that every practice, every note, every small performance brought her closer to the day when the world would have no choice but to listen. Even after the rejection, she could not stop thinking about the competition. Every morning, as sunlight spilled into her small room, her violin waited quietly in the corner. She would sit by it for hours, letting her fingers run along the strings, testing notes and experimenting with melodies. The first few weeks were the hardest. Doubt crept in constantly, whispering that maybe she was not good enough, that her dreams were unrealistic. But every time she played, the doubts faded. The music reminded her who she really was, and why she had begun this journey in the first place. Her routine became strict. She would wake early, practice for a few hours before school, then carry her violin case carefully as she walked to her classes. At school, she tried to blend in, though her mind often drifted to new compositions, to imagining herself playing in front of real audiences. Sometimes she would sneak away to a quiet corner of the school library, where she could hum softly to herself or sketch music notes in a notebook she kept hidden. Every secret practice built her confidence bit by bit. At home, she had to fight for time. Her family did what they could, but life was busy. Her parents worried about her studies, her younger siblings needed attention, and chores piled up. Yet she found small moments, a few minutes while the tea boiled, quiet hour in the evening, a rainy afternoon when everyone was inside. She learned to make every moment count, understanding that persistence often came from tiny steps rather than big leaps. Sometimes, her friends at school teased her gently, asking why she spent so much time on something that might never pay off. She would smile and explain a little, but most of the time, she simply nodded, knowing they could not fully understand. Their doubts stung at first, but gradually, she stopped caring. She realized that the most important audience was not the world, but herself. If she could play with honesty, she would be content. Even if no one else listened, she began exploring music more deeply, studying not only pieces she liked, but also different styles and techniques. She watched videos of performances from distant countries, learning how artists moved, how they expressed emotion, and how their music could tell a story without words. She tried to replicate their style at first, then slowly blended it with her own ideas. Over time, her music became more original, infused with the struggles and joys she had experienced. Each note she played carried a part of her life, her quiet victories, and her hidden sorrows. One day, she decided to try something new. Instead of playing in her room alone, she went to a nearby park. She found a bench under a tree and began to play, unsure if anyone would notice. At first, there was only the sound of wind and distant footsteps, but soon, a few people stopped to listen. A woman leaned on her stroller, a teenager paused mid-run, and a man reading a book closed it quietly to pay attention. They did not know her name, they did not know her story, but for a few moments her music connected with them. Their silent presence felt like recognition, small yet powerful. Encouraged by this, she began to seek more opportunities to play in public spaces. She visited cafes, community centers, and libraries, always asking politely if she could perform. At first, most people said no, but she persisted. Slowly, she began to be accepted in small venues, and the feeling of touching strangers' hearts through her music strengthened her determination. She realized that her talent did not need permission from judges or competitions. The world could listen if she created her own chances. Despite these small victories, her inner struggle continued. She sometimes felt loneliness, frustration, and exhaustion. Her fingers would ache from long practice, and her mind would feel heavy with self-doubt. There were nights when she considered giving up, thinking maybe the world would never accept her music. But every time she picked up her violin, a sense of purpose returned. She remembered the nights she had spent dreaming, the melodies that had comforted her during difficult moments, and the promise she had made to herself never to stop. She also discovered that sharing her struggles with others helped. She joined online communities of musicians who, like her, faced obstacles and rejections. They exchanged tips, shared performances, and offered words of encouragement. Hearing their stories made her feel less alone. She understood that rejection was not a measure of talent, but often a test of persistence. Each message of encouragement, each kind comment, became a small flame that fueled her drive. Her family slowly began to notice the changes in her. Her dedication became impossible to ignore. They saw the concentration in her eyes, the way she could play for hours without fatigue, and the joy that music brought to her life. Even though they still worried about her future, they began to support her more openly. Her father repaired her violin meticulously whenever it needed care, and her mother prepared snacks for her long practice sessions. Their quiet support gave her strength and reminded her that she was not entirely alone in her journey. Months passed, and her skill improved remarkably. Her practice transformed from mechanical repetition to expressive storytelling. She could convey sadness, hope, anger, and joy through her playing. She experimented with dynamics, tempo, and style, learning to control every nuance of the sound. Recording herself on a small device, she listened critically, analyzed mistakes, and refined her performances. Each day, her music grew richer, more precise, and more heartfelt. One day, a small community event invited her to perform. It was not a competition, but a chance to play in front of a few dozen people. She felt nervous, her hands trembling, but she remembered all the hours of practice and every small step she had taken. She took a deep breath and began to play. At first, her notes were careful, cautious, but gradually, she let herself flow with the music. The audience grew quiet, captivated by the melody, and she realized that every rejection, every struggle, had led to this moment. When she finished, the crowd clapped softly, some people wiping tears from their eyes, others smiling with appreciation. She felt a sense of accomplishment she had never known before. It was not about winning or being recognized by a prestigious judge. It was about touching hearts, about the connection between her music and others. She understood that these small moments were just as valuable as any grand stage, and that her journey was far from over. Walking home after the event, she felt a mixture of relief and excitement. The violin case felt lighter, her steps more confident. She thought about the future, about performances yet to come, and about the music still inside her waiting to be shared. The competition she had been denied still lingered in her mind, but it no longer had power over her dreams. She had learned that persistence, honesty, and courage were just as important as talent, and that by staying true to herself, she could find ways to reach the world on her own terms. Night fell, and she sat by her window, violin in hand, practicing softly while the town slept. The music floated into the quiet streets, a secret she shared with the night. Each note was a promise to herself, a statement that her voice mattered, that her dream was real, and that no rejection could stop her from continuing her journey. In those moments, she felt free, alive, and certain that the path she had chosen, though difficult, was exactly where she was meant to be. Time moved on. But the memory of being rejected from the competition never left her. She carried it like a quiet scar, a reminder of how close she had come to a dream and how easily it had been taken away. Yet, instead of breaking her, it strengthened her. She continued to practice every day, letting the violin speak when words could not. Her music became richer, more expressive, filled with all the feelings she had bottled up: anger, sadness, hope, and determination. Each practice session became a journey, not only improving her skill, but also helping her understand herself in ways she had never imagined. One afternoon, as she walked through the town, she noticed a poster for a small local music event. It was not a prestigious competition, but it offered performers a chance to play in front of a live audience. The event organizers had set aside a few minutes for anyone who wanted to showcase their talent. It was last minute, and the spots were filling quickly, but something inside her stirred. This was not the big stage she had dreamed of, but it was a door that had opened, even if only slightly. She hesitated, her mind racing with doubts. But then she remembered all the nights she had spent practicing, all the effort she had poured into her music. She knew she could not let the opportunity pass. She arrived at the venue early, clutching her violin case tightly. Backstage, performers from the area were preparing, some with fancy instruments, others with formal training. She felt out of place, a quiet girl with no connections, no certificates, just her violin and her determination. The organizers looked at her application and frowned, unsure if they could fit her in. One of them muttered that there might not be time, that the schedule was already packed. She felt her heart sink, the familiar sting of rejection threatening to overwhelm her. She took a deep breath and politely insisted, explaining that she had prepared and would be ready in moments. They exchanged doubtful glances, but eventually they relented and allowed her a small slot at the end. As she waited, her hands shook. The other performers rehearsed, each note polished and rehearsed. She felt intimidated, wondering if she would sound out of place, if the audience would notice her mistakes. But she reminded herself that she had worked harder than anyone knew. The violin had carried her through nights of doubt and loneliness, and now it was her voice to share. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and imagined herself performing not for judgment, but for the love of the music. When her turn finally came, she stepped onto the small stage. The lights were simple, the audience modest, but the moment felt enormous. She lifted her violin, placed the bow on the strings, and began to play. At first the notes were tentative, but then she allowed herself to immerse in the music. Each melody carried her story, each note a reflection of her struggles and her passion. The audience grew quiet, drawn in by the raw emotion she conveyed. Conversations stopped, phones were put away, and all eyes followed her movements. She forgot the size of the crowd, the schedule, and the fear. It was just her and the music. The piece she chose was one she had been practicing for months, a composition that demanded precision and control, but also emotional depth. As she played, she felt every emotion she had ever experienced flowing through the strings, the frustration of being denied, the loneliness of practicing in silence, the quiet triumphs of her secret accomplishments. Her fingers moved with confidence, her bow drew smooth lines, and the music seemed to soar above the room. She noticed a few people leaning forward, captivated, and even some tears glistening in the eyes of audience members. She had never expected such a reaction, and it filled her with a mix of surprise and pride. By the time she reached the final note, the room was silent for a moment, as if everyone held their breath. Then, slowly, applause began, soft at first, then swelling into genuine appreciation. She lowered her violin, her hands trembling, not from nervousness now, but from the intensity of the performance. The applause continued. People stood, clapped, and cheered, some calling out her name, though she had never introduced herself. She realized that for the first time. Her music had truly reached an audience, had connected with strangers, and had spoken a story that words could never capture. Backstage, the organizers who had doubted her now looked at her differently. Some approached with smiles, congratulating her on a performance that had clearly exceeded expectations. Others asked how long she had been playing, where she had trained. She simply smiled and said she had practiced a lot, letting the music speak for itself. She noticed the other performers watching her quietly, perhaps a little in awe, and she felt a quiet sense of vindication. All the private hours, all the hidden efforts, had culminated in this moment. After the event, people approached her, offering compliments, some even asking for her to play again. She felt a sense of community she had never experienced before. Music had always been personal, a private sanctuary, but now it had become a bridge connecting her to others. She realized that her journey was no longer just about proving herself to judges or competitions. It was about sharing something real, something deeply human that could touch others' hearts. She began to understand that recognition could come in small, unexpected ways, not always from official channels, but from those who truly listened. Walking home that evening, she held her violin close, feeling lighter than she had in months. The rain had started to fall softly, but she did not mind. She imagined the sound of her violin mixing with the patter of rain, the music blending with the world outside her room for the first time. She thought about the rejection she had faced, the doubt that had lingered, and how far she had come simply by refusing to give up. The experience taught her that persistence and courage were just as important as talent, and that sometimes opportunity did not arrive in perfect form. It had to be recognized and seized, no matter how small or unexpected. The next days were filled with reflection. She replayed the performance in her mind, remembering every note, every expression, and every reaction from the audience. It had been a turning point, a moment that changed how she saw herself and her music. She began planning ways to perform more often, to find spaces where her music could be heard, and to connect with people who shared her love for music. The idea of competitions still existed in her mind, but they no longer held the power to define her worth. She had discovered a truth. Music was about connection, passion, and persistence, not validation from others. Her family noticed the change in her energy. She moved with more confidence, spoke with a new quiet assurance, and her eyes held a spark that had been missing before. Even her siblings, who once teased her gently about spending too much time on her violin, watched her with curiosity and admiration. Her parents smiled more often, seeing the joy and fulfillment that music brought her. And they stopped worrying so much about her future. They understood, in their own way, that her music was not just a hobby, it was her identity. She continued practicing with renewed vigor, inspired by the experience. She experimented with new pieces, refined her techniques, and explored emotional depths she had not touched before. She began to dream bigger, imagining playing in larger venues, sharing her music with more people, and perhaps one day inspiring others who faced similar struggles. The path was still challenging, filled with uncertainty, but the moment on that small stage had given her confidence that she could face. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, evenings were spent by her window, violin in hand, letting the music float into the quiet streets. Neighbors sometimes paused to listen, children would peek curiously, and she felt a subtle connection to the world outside her room. The sound of her music became a symbol of her journey defined not by rejection or approval, but by resilience, courage, and the refusal to let dreams die quietly in the corner. Each note was a declaration of her determination, a statement that she belonged in the world of music, and a promise that she would continue, no matter the challenges that awaited. Months passed since her small performance at the local event. Her confidence grew steadily. She practiced longer hours, experimented with more difficult pieces, and pushed her musical abilities further than she had ever imagined. Every day she discovered new aspects of the violin, new ways to express feelings, and new depths in her own emotions. Her music had begun to carry more than melodies. It carried her story, her struggle, and her relentless hope. One day, an opportunity appeared unexpectedly. A citywide cultural event, known for showcasing young talent, had a few slots open due to last-minute cancellations. The organizers were in a rush to fill the spots and allowed anyone interested to perform if they could come quickly and be ready. She heard about this chance from a friend in her online music community. Her heart raced as she realized this could be bigger than anything she had done before. It was not a formal competition, but the audience would be larger, the atmosphere more professional, and the exposure far greater. Yet fear and doubt crept in. What if she was still not good enough? What if she faltered in front of so many people? Despite her nervousness, she decided to go. She spent the night preparing, rehearsing every note, imagining every movement, and visualizing the audience's reactions. She packed her violin carefully, checked every string, and made sure the bow was ready. The next morning, she set out with determination, even though her hands shook slightly with anticipation. This time, there was no guarantee of acceptance, There was only the possibility, and that was enough to keep her moving forward. Arriving at the venue, she was struck by the scale of the event. The hall was large, the stage impressive, and young performers from all over the city were preparing. Her heart sank for a moment as she felt out of place among so many formally trained musicians. Her clothing was simple, her violin modest, but she reminded herself that talent and passion could speak louder than appearances. She signed in, and the organizers gave her a small slot at the end of the schedule. She would perform last, with only a few minutes to make an impression. Backstage, she watched the other performances. Musicians played with precision and technical mastery, their bows moving expertly, their notes perfect. She felt a familiar pang of doubt, wondering if her own performance would measure up. But she took a deep breath and remembered all the practice. All the quiet nights in her room. All the small moments when she had shared her music with strangers who had listened and felt her heart. She realized that the most important thing was not perfection, but authenticity. And that truth could touch people in ways technical skill alone could not. When her turn finally came, she walked onto the stage, the bright lights making her squint for a moment. She placed the violin under her chin, took a deep breath, and let the bow meet the strings. The first notes were soft, tentative, almost shy, but as she continued, she felt the music take over. Her fingers moved with precision, but more importantly, with emotion. She played not for the judges, not for applause, but for the story that had been growing inside her for years, the story of struggle, persistence, and hope. The audience was quiet at first, some whispering among themselves, but soon, the music captured everyone's attention. She poured everything she had into the performance. The months of secret practice, the nights of doubt, the moments of triumph, and the unspoken dreams. The melodies rose and fell, carrying both delicacy and intensity. She felt a powerful connection with the audience, as if the music had built a bridge between her heart and theirs. Some listeners closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others leaned forward, captivated by the depth and emotion of her playing. By the middle of the piece, she could feel the energy in the room change. The atmosphere grew electric, filled with anticipation and awe. People who had been chatting quietly now sat on the edge of their seats, unable to tear their eyes away. She felt a surge of adrenaline and courage, allowing her to play more boldly, to add subtle nuances that brought the piece to life. Every note became a statement. Every chord a declaration that she belonged on that stage, that her music had power, and that she had fought hard for this moment. As the final notes echoed through the hall, there was a pause, a moment of stunned silence. The audience seemed to catch their breath, and then applause erupted, loud, warm, and sustained. People stood to cheer, clapped enthusiastically, and some even wiped tears from their eyes. She lowered her violin, overwhelmed with emotion. She had never experienced anything like this before. The performance had not only been noticed, it had moved people deeply. She realized that her persistence, patience, and passion had finally created a moment where the world could see her talent in its full truth. Backstage, the organizers approached her with wide smiles and admiration. Some were curious about her background, astonished to learn that she had no formal training. Others praised the emotion and depth she had brought to the performance. She answered modestly, letting her music speak for itself, but inside, she felt a quiet pride. Every long night, every hidden practice, every moment of self-doubt had led to this. For the first time, she understood that her journey had meaning beyond the small victories she had experienced before. She was not defined by rejection. She was defined by her persistence and authenticity. News of her performance began to spread. People approached her after the event, expressing amazement and asking to hear her play again. Invitations for small performances, collaborations, and local shows started coming her way. She had never imagined this would happen so quickly, but she realized that the music had a life of its own, carrying her story far beyond her small town and her quiet room. She understood that recognition could be earned not only through competitions or certificates, but through the honesty and power of her own voice. The following weeks were filled with preparation for new performances. She continued to practice, refining her technique and exploring new pieces that challenged her. She began to feel more confident, not because of the applause or recognition, but because she had learned to trust herself and her abilities. She knew now that even if the world tried to close doors, she could create her own opportunities and connect with people in meaningful ways. Her family watched her transformation with admiration. They saw a young woman growing into her talent, gaining courage and confidence. They noticed how she carried herself differently, how her presence seemed to command quiet respect, and how her eyes sparkled when she spoke of music. Though they still worried about her future, they could no longer question the importance of her passion. They saw that music was not a hobby, but the very essence of who she was, and they began to support her in every way they could. At night, she would sit by her window, violin in hand, playing softly as the stars twinkled above. The quiet streets seemed to listen, carrying her music into the world beyond her home. She felt a sense of freedom she had never known before. The violin was no